Now, as a B2B SaaS consultant, my clients are frequently asking me what they should be measuring in order to determine how well their company is performing. Now, in the world of B2B SaaS, one of the great things is that we have access to a lot of quantitative data, which allows us to measure quite a bit. That can be helpful, but it's also a place where we can easily get lost because there are so many acronyms and potential things that you might want to measure, so it gets a little bit confusing in terms of where you need to focus first. So that's really the challenge here and the reason why I created this video. I want to go through with you my process of measuring the foundational elements of a healthy B2B SaaS company so that you can start there. Now, once you've started there, you can always add to it as much as you'd like. But what I really want to do is I want to focus in the area of measuring what matters most. So let's get into it. Okay, so here's the challenge. On this slide, you can see a bunch of different acronyms, some of which you may be familiar with, others you may not. The problem is this is only a fraction of what might get tossed at you, depending on who you're speaking with in terms of what you may be measuring and what they may be looking for information-wise. Now, if you know what all these are, great, but what I want to share with you is that there are metrics that are foundational to the success that more than likely you want to make. And I want to talk to you about how to measure those in a series of steps to make sure that this process is not overwhelming for you. Because if you just dive deep into the metrics and you hyper focus on those, you might miss the bigger picture, and I don't want that to happen. Above all else, I want you to be focused on growth. So that's my number one here. And in order to calculate growth for a B2B SaaS business, you need a couple of other metrics in order to figure out what your value is and then ultimately interpret where it is to mean whether or not you're making the kind of progress that you were hoping for. So the growth that I'm looking for here is a ratio, but it's a ratio of two other metrics. They're shown here on this slide, and the first one is called LTV, which stands for lifetime value of your customer. The second one is referred to as CAC, or customer acquisition costs. Now, when you take the ratio of these two metrics, you should get a value. Now that value, typically we want that to be greater than 3. So if you're taking your LTV and you're dividing it by your CAC, we want that value to be greater than 3. That will provide you with the level of confidence that your growth rate for your B2B SaaS business is in a healthy range. Now, first, let's break down what each of these components in this calculation mean. So the lifetime value of your customer means for whatever your customer is paying while they are paying and have an active subscription for your B2B SaaS, that qualifies as the lifetime value of your customer. So if we take an example of perhaps $100 per month, maybe what your B2B SaaS is costing your customer, and on average, your customers stay with you for a period of 6 months, then the lifetime value of your customer is $600 because we take the $100, we multiply that by 6 months, that's how we get $600. Now, the customer acquisition cost is what it is costing you in order to acquire that customer so that we can find out essentially whether or not you're getting a strong return. And if you watch any of my other content, you know how important return on investment can be. That's essentially what we're trying to get at here, but specifically for how it's measured for a B2B SaaS business. Now, the customer acquisition cost example I'll give you is, let's say, for example, to get that same customer for which the lifetime value is $600, it cost you $200. As in, you spent $200 over that period in order to acquire that customer. Maybe you put that into ads, or you took your entire ad budget, divided it by the number of customers you got from that, and it leveled out to about $200 per customer in terms of which customers and how many of them you were able to acquire. So now, if we take those two numbers and we divide the lifetime value of the customer, $600, by the customer acquisition cost, $200, we wind up with 3. And that is the objective here, is to make sure that your metric for LTV divided by CAC is at least 3 or greater. That indicates a healthy growth trajectory for a B2B SaaS business. Now, there are a couple of ways to interpret the result of this calculation, if the number is too high or the number is too low. Now, if that number is too low, there could be any number of different reasons for that. You may not be charging enough for access to your product. You may be paying too much for acquiring those customers, or perhaps both. So we want to make sure, again, that we get that number at a healthy range. Now, the second potential scenario is where your ratio here winds up being too high, as in maybe it's well above 3, maybe it's 10 or greater than that. Now, this might mean that you're undercharging for access to your customer, meaning that you could grow more aggressively a number of other metrics that are going to be very important for the health of your B2B SaaS business. And you can take a look at this calculation in order to figure out whether or not you can make some of those adjustments. Now, one question I get quite a bit when I'm talking about measuring this criteria is, what if my product is new, or what if my customers haven't turned over yet? As in, maybe I'm not sure exactly what my LTV is, which makes this calculation a little bit more difficult. That's a totally fair question, and almost every SaaS business runs into it. Now, what I'd recommend in that case is you can start taking the phases and measuring it in terms of as it's developing, so you can track it over time. As in, it doesn't just need to be a static value for which you need to have concrete data you don't have yet in order to calculate. You can certainly calculate it for month 1, month 2, month 3, and so on until customers start turning over. That way, you'll start to get an idea for what that value is almost in real time, or over time, more importantly, so that you can get a better understanding of whether or not it is already within a healthy range, or it's telling you enough to the extent where you may want to start making changes even before you get the rest of that information. So once we know your B2B SaaS is in a good spot as it pertains to growth, the next thing we want to focus on is what type of value are your customers getting out of using your product. As such, I want to take a better look at usage. As in, what does usage look like in your B2B SaaS product from the perspective of the activity within your product? Now, there's a couple of ways to measure that, and there's a couple of metrics in particular around the frequency in which we might measure something like that. But this has to do in particular with analytics and other ways that we can get this data to figure out what the frequency and the active usage looks like within your product. Now, some of those are referred to typically as active users, as in on a daily basis, a weekly basis, a monthly basis, and a couple of those mentioned here, like DAO or MAO, that's how those are pronounced, as in how many users within your product are active on a daily basis, how many users within your product are active on a monthly basis. Now, obviously the examples that I gave are dependent upon certain levels of frequency, as in depending upon your product, there may be one or the other here that is a bit more relevant because you're expecting more of a daily usage or a monthly usage. But regardless, whatever your product is intending to do, it's important to make sure that your customers, paying customers, are using your product on a regular basis. There's a level of threshold that we want to try to reach when it comes to measuring active usage as well, and that is around 40%, as in we would like at least 40% of your paying users to be active in your product on one or other of these frequencies by at least 40% of that population. That's the goal here. Now, if your number winds up being below that threshold, that could mean that your value proposition is too weak and your customers are not getting the kind of value out of the product experience they were expecting to. So you might need to dive deeper, perform more discovery, figure out what you need to do to get that percentage to be a bit higher. Because if customers are coming to your product, coming to your website, converting into paying customers, starting with your product, but then ultimately not continuing to use your product, that could be an early sign of a problem that's going to only make what you want to do more difficult at scale. So that's how to figure out whether or not ultimately your customers are using your product actively enough to speak volumes in terms of the value that they're getting out of it. And you can determine that by measuring their active usage. If you've consumed any additional content from me, you'll know how important I believe that profitability and return on investment are to the success that ultimately you want to have. Now, profitability is a strong area of focus even for the early phases of a B2B SaaS business, because it's really important for financial independence, for you to be able to control ultimately the destiny of your organization, for you to be able to build ultimately a healthy business. So how do we determine profitability and how do we measure that for a B2B SaaS business? Well, one way in particular is to calculate what's referred to as the gross margin. I've got the equation here, but the gross margin or the gross profit margin, those are two different ways to think of the same metric, is determined by taking the revenue that your product is capable of generating and subtracting out your cost of goods sold, or what's often pronounced as COGS. You take your revenue, you subtract your cost of goods sold, and the number that you're left with as a ratio out of your total revenue should be at least 75%. trending towards 80% or potentially higher. But anywhere between that 75-80% threshold is a great, healthy place to be for a B2B SaaS business. Now, these numbers, unique to typically B2B SaaS businesses, are typically considerably higher than you might find in other different types of business, and that's because SaaS businesses and software businesses in general have greater potential to reach scale, and their scalability is just able to produce results at a different level. So that's why these numbers are typically so high. But you need to make sure that for your SaaS business, that these numbers are in line. Otherwise, you're going to struggle with profitability and scale, and that level of performance is going to be something that's going to be very difficult to try to make up for if it's not ending up there, even in the early phases of what you're trying to do and build and grow and scale your company. Now, if these numbers ultimately come in low for your B2B SaaS business at the moment, that could mean a number of different things. You may not be charging enough for access to your product. You may be paying too much to run your operation, potentially both. So either one or both of those can be a risk, and you want to make sure that you get those in line to make sure that you get this number up. Otherwise, this is something that's only going to become more troublesome as you reach greater scale and continue to make progress with your B2B SaaS business. All right, so I want to walk you through a relatively similar case study to one of my own B2B SaaS businesses to give you an idea what calculating these metrics ultimately looks like and then interpreting the results. So for one of my SaaS businesses, which is in the HR tech space, these are numbers in terms of where we're performing at the moment. So in order to determine the ratio relative to growth, which we talked about first, and LTV divided by CAC, ultimately ours is around 3.5. And that comes from numbers of what we're charging on a monthly basis for access to the product, or $500 a month, and the average lifetime value of a customer being about 6 months because the product is utilized when it comes to hiring. So that's typically how our customers are using them. Taking that 6 months and multiplying it by $500 per month gives us a number around $3,000 for the lifetime value of one of our customers. And then taking a closer look at our customer acquisition cost, which is around $850, we take the $3,000, we divide that by 850, and we get a number around 3.5, which is right in line with kind of where we want to be. It has been trending higher, so we're going to keep an eye on that. That might mean raising our prices or making some different types of adjustments there. But for right now, we're in a good spot in terms of where we want that metric to be. Over 3, again, is the threshold that we want to try to achieve. Now that we know that growth is in a good spot for where we want to be as a B2B SaaS business, we could start looking at, okay, what does active usage look like for our product? So we took a look at and we measured both our daily active usage and our monthly active usage. And if you remember, this threshold here is intended to be at or above around 40%. Now, as you can see on this visual, our daily active usage is under that threshold at around 33%, but our monthly active usage is above that threshold at or around 48%. Now, the reason for this is because of what our product in particular does. It helps typically HR departments specifically with hiring, meaning that the daily active usage is not as common as the monthly active usage based on their process and routine. As such, this information isn't particularly alarming to us because we know how our customers like to use our product. So that's something to keep in mind here. Now, even though I've given you the examples in terms of how to calculate these and where the threshold should be, there could be unique situations where, because of your product and your situation, then one or more of these metrics and thresholds may be particularly relevant specifically to your industry or your customer or however your process works. So if you're unsure about any of that, reach out to me and the information that I provided in the description below in order to figure out if any of your numbers are coming back in or around a range that you weren't expecting them to. I can help you figure out whether or not that is relatively normal or to be expected given any combination of those variables that you're managing. So because our monthly active usage is above that threshold, then we feel like we're in a good spot. We would like to see more daily active usage, but our product really just doesn't meet that experience need at the moment. So if that changes, that'll probably become more important. Now, on to profitability, right? We need to ensure that what we're doing is generating healthy profit and that our margin is in a good spot so that we know that our business is performing accordingly. Now, if we take our revenue and we subtract our cost of goods sold, right now, our gross margin or our gross profit margin is in or around 82%, which is above that threshold of 80%. However, this has been trending higher, so we may make some adjustments here as well too. In fact, we'll probably be investing more into our team so that we have more frontline operators in that cost of goods sold metric in terms of determining that. That's typically for a SaaS business, your hosting cost and your frontline operations, etc. So we may invest a little bit more in there, which is going to bring our margin down probably a little bit if nothing else changes, but that's okay with us because we're already kind of above that threshold. So I wanted to walk through with you an actual example of calculating this for a real B2B SaaS business so that you have an idea in terms of what the numbers ultimately might come out looking like, and then you can ultimately compare them to yours. Again, if you have questions about this, reach out to me in the contact information that I provided in the description below so I can help you figure out what they should be for your business and whether or not they're considered to be in a normal range. To summarize, the 3 areas that I feel that are most important to make sure that you're measuring to ensure the right level of success for your B2B SaaS business. First is related to growth, the second is related to usage, and the third is related to profitability. We want your LTV divided by your CAC to be at or greater than 3. We want your active usage to be above the threshold that is 40% to ensure that they're getting the right kind of value out of it. And we want to make sure that you have a healthy gross profit margin to make sure that your business is set up ultimately for success as you continue to scale. So those are the most important metrics in my opinion to start with, but there's plenty more that you can add beyond that. I just really want to make sure that you focus there first. Thanks for watching my content. I hope you got value out of it. If you did, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel so you can be notified when more content like this becomes available. My question for you, which I'd love for you to answer in the comments below, is what do you feel is the most important thing to measure about the performance and success of your B2B SaaS business and why?